Hi everyone, welcome to week 6, and this is our 6th video. Today I will be doing a lecture on um, the essay by David Smith in chapter um, chapter 7, proposing a solution. Right. So the essay's title is Getting to Pluribus Unum. Right. So have that. Make sure you read that essay before listening to the lecture. It's a short essay, so it's going to be a quick read for you. But try to read it before listening to my lecture, and also have my notes that I've sent you handy when listening to the lecture. So I guess I'll start with a little bit of context about what he's talking about here, right? Um, so this article was published in the New York Times in 2017, right? And so he's responding to sort of like right after the election of Donald Trump, right? And January 2017, so I'm guessing this is the transition period, right? Because the inauguration for the new president is usually towards the end of January, right? And so I'm not sure exactly if this was before or after the inauguration of Donald Trump, right? But this is definitely after Donald Trump has been elected president, right? And so here, I think he's responding to not necessarily Donald Trump's, not necessarily towards Donald Trump, right, but sort of responding to the kind of uh, polarity, I guess, right, the divide between specifically, two parties, right, in America: conservative party, red party, as he refers here, and the blue party, which is the Democrats, right? So, and if you watch the news, even if you don't watch a lot of news, if you just sort of like being around TV, right? I'm sure you have a sense of how sort of how strong, right, the kind of discussion against, for or against each other, right, for or against Donald Trump, right. And so there's a very, very strong divide in the country, polarization, right, political kind of polarization that's ever more sort of clearer right now, right, than in the past, right. And so that kind of polarity is what I think David Smith is addressing here, right? So like that for him is the problem, right? Like why are we so divided as a country, right? And to a point where it's gotten very violent, right? Um, and right, so that for David Smith is the problem that he wants to propose a solution for, right? um, and so we'll start with the first paragraph, right? I'll just read it out loud. President Obama, as part of his swan song, right? Swan song that just means kind of last hurrah, right? Last kind of performance, right? President Obama, as part of his swan song, recently traveled overseas, touting the benefits of international engagement and study abroad. In mid-November, we also celebrated International Education Week, sponsored by the U.S. Department of State to advance global understanding. As a college educator for over 30 years, as well as someone who was a U.S. Fulbright scholar and now has a son in the Peace Corps, um, I believe the benefits of international education are incontrovertible, right? So that's the first paragraph, right? That's his introduction to to his essay. And there's let's talk about what he's doing here, right? So so first, by mentioning President Obama, right, and President Obama's effort to sort of to be more engaged internationally, right, and more specifically, more engaged or to engage our students, American students, in sort of like the international arena, right. Sort of pointing out that even President Obama is already sort of doing this, right, or promoting this study abroad program. By pointing that out, I think he's sort of like adding to the, he's sort of like adding a political weight, right, to his arguments, right, saying that, oh, President Obama is doing this, so this must be important, right. And so by mentioning Obama, he's sort of adding to the credibility of his proposition, right. And then let's go to, and so the second part of the introduction here that I've highlighted in the notes, I'll just read it out loud. As a college educator for over 30 years, as well as someone who was a Fulbright scholar and now has a son in the Peace Corps, I believe that the benefits of international education are incontrovertible, right? So I think that is his thesis, right? I'm saying I think because I think he could have been more clear, but that's fine. He's a professor, so I'll assume that he knows what he's doing. But right, and we can talk about this and how we might be able to adjust it and change it up, right, just to make it clearer, right? For the purpose of our, what we do in this class, we want to, as much as possible, be as clear, right, as possible. And so we can talk about that a little bit later. But what I want to point out in this thesis, right, is it's sort of like personal quality, right? So right away, as a college educator, right, I believe the benefits, blah, 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 right? Pointing out that he's had a Fulbright, he was a Fulbright scholar. And if you're not familiar with Fulbright scholarship, it's a sort of kind of like an American-funded scholarship that allows American students, American citizens, more specifically, to study abroad, right? Usually kind of like, if you're an undergrad or graduate student and you want to spend a year in a different country, in a university in another country to do research, right? The Fulbright scholar gives you, funding to sort of like do this research, right? That's something that I'm also interested in, and I actually want to apply for a Fulbright scholarship next year to get funding to do research in the Philippines, right? And so, right. So that's the Fulbright scholarship that he's mentioning that he has, right? And so, right, by saying, or the tone, right, of this thesis is that it's personal, right? And we know right away that this is a personal opinion, right, which is perfectly fine, and you can imitate this kind of personal sort of like point of view, right, first person point of view, as long as obviously sort of like you back it up with your sources, your research, right, and so for this purposes, it's he's making it personal, right, that's something to sort of like recognize, right? And as you read his paper, you're going to find out that yes, he is basing this in his own sort of personal experience as a professor and as a scholar, right? and in his experience as an international student too, right? Um, and so also by saying, right, I believe, right, in the thesis, that is his way of sort of like qualifying, right, that what he's going to propose is is his own sort of like observation, his own sort of is based on his own experience of how to address this problem of political and sort of cultural division in the country, right? And but as we sort of find out later on, he's going to back that up with research, right? And I just want to say that this specific paper, he does not really quote a lot of people, right? But for his context, right, he's a professor, he's a researcher, and he's quoting himself, and that's perfectly fine because he's in that position where he's sort of like that's part of what he does, right? And he knows what he already wants to say. But for our purposes, right, for this essay, I still want to see you use quotations and integrate quotations into your sentences, right, and make sure you're citing your sources, right. I still want to see that throughout your paper, even though he's not doing it here, because this is a specific type of work. But I think it's important. This essay is important just to kind of like see the style and how he's sort of constructing his argument, right? Okay, so let's move on to paragraph 2, right? So top of paragraph 2. But we learned something about our nation as a result of the presidential election of Donald Trump, that is, that has caused me to reflect on whether the emphasis on international exchange has come at the expense of achieving important domestic understanding. Right. So I think that's a good sentence because what he is eventually going to do, right, is talk about international exchange studies, right, and or international exchange programs, right, like international studies, right, like going to another country. But what he's actually saying is that this, using the international model, we can actually do that within the United States, right? And so key here is that the emphasis on international exchange has come to the expense of achieving important domestic understanding, right? So he's saying that the way to address the problem is actually by taking an international model of, international exchange studies and making that domestic, right? Instead of going from America to another country, we can actually do that state by state, right? So, for example, students in Texas would do an exchange study program in New York, right, or in LA, or whatever, right, and vice versa, right. So he's using the international model and making that domestic, right, in order to address the domestic issue of sort of political and cultural divisions in America, right. So here, the second part of paragraph 2, he's sort of pointing out the issues, right? We have become, in a broad context, a nation of strangers, right? We are now at a place where our failure to engage with one another has resulted in the most significant divide since the Civil Rights era, or maybe even the Civil War. A recent CNN poll revealed that 85% of Americans feel we are more divided than ever, right? So here he's sort of um, he's linking the current division, right, to sort of like the past, to the Civil War, right? That this sort of like division has actually happened before, and it's not something new to America. But how do we sort of like address it in its more sort of current context, right? And then notice that he's also using statistics here to back um, his information, right? All right, so let's go to paragraph 4, right? So paragraph 4, I'm just going to read it. Pundits are replete with answers addressing the reasons for the election result, right? Was it educational differences with Clinton supporters having more education than Trump supporters? Was it economic differences, the Trump supporters having never recovered from the Great Recession, right? Or was it anxiety from middle-aged white voters rejecting the social liberalism of the West Coast, New England, and especially Washington, D.C.? We will debate this for a long time, and I'm not sure that there is one answer. It is probably a convergence of conditions, right? So here he is pointing out the pundits. He's referring to, kind of like mainstream news reporters, news commentators, and all these people that you hear in the news, right? And if you watch the news, this is the kind of conversation that happens, right? Like, is it poor people sort of voting for Trump because of desperation? Is it uneducated people? Is it, like, what factors? They're trying to sort of like make sense of this division by sort of like talking about, the economic factors, the educational factors, right? That sort of like led to the election of Donald Trump, right? Um, and so he's pointing that out, but he's actually not sort of engaging with that, right? Like, that's for him. Um, these are not for him. Um, these are realistic questions, right? And he thinks that these are important questions, but this is not the kinds of questions that he wants to address, right? And he's saying that these questions are valid and they're probably it's probably worth looking into them, but these are not sort of like these questions are not in the scope of what he's trying to solve, right, or propose a solution to, right? So this is his part of acknowledging opposing viewpoints, right? All right, so let's go to paragraph 5, right? Um, quote, but I do have one idea of where we might go from here, or a way of helping our couple, Blue America and Red America, to get to know each other again. We should establish a national exchange program for American college students that takes them from the often comfortable environments and provides them with the opportunity to get to know people in other parts of the country and in different settings, right? So here he is explaining his proposal in more detail, right? That for him, his actual proposal is, instead of international exchange programs, international study abroad or study abroad program, right? Um, what he's proposing is a national exchange program, right, for American college students. And this is his sort of solution, right, to this problem. Um, and so I was talking about the thesis and how he could have been clearer, right? So what I would do, right, to sort of make his thesis clearer was to mention, right, that because in the thesis he was only mentioning the importance of international exchange program, right? But he didn't mention that he's actually going to be talking about domestic exchange program as a solution to the problem, right? When I read the first paragraph, I thought that he was going to say that, if Americans study internationally more, they would be more open-minded. That was my sense of the first paragraph, right? But in fact, his argument is to say that to use that model of international exchange program and make it domestic, right? So I wished he included that part of saying that he's gonna use it in a domestic sense, right? So that's my only thing about his thesis. Right, so in paragraph 6, he says, quote, in international exchange, the emphasis is cultural, right? So this is part of his defense, right? So he's, because there's not enough sort of data to back up his proposal of domestic exchange program, he's using the international model to sort of to defend his proposal, right? Or to kind of like to back up his proposal, right? So for him, the importance of international exchange program is cultural, right? And in the sense that, for students who engage in international exchange program, they would go to another country, right? And they usually get hosted, or they live with a family, right? In that country, in that city. And then they obviously go to school, go to university in that country, right? And so part of that program is not just to learn in the university, right? But also to get to know people, right? So like the host family, right? Get to know people, get to know their food, get to know their culture, right? So part of that exchange program is not just educational, but also cultural, right? In the sense that you experience other countries' culture by studying there, right? And not just getting information, educational knowledge, right? But also cultural. So so that's part of the importance of international exchange program, right? So what he's suggesting here is that that sort of that that cultural exchange can actually work in America, right? Because of how divided we are. In order to sort of bridge that divide, is by letting people see other culture, other American culture, right? And it's actually a good idea, I think, because America is very big, right? It's almost like a continent in itself, right? Which is very unique. And so it's very possible that even though we are one country, each state has very sort of distinct cultural, or each regions, not just states, right? We'll say like the South or like Midwest, right? So each kind of like there's a lot of like pockets in America that have different sort of values, different sort of like cultures and traditions and blah blah blah. Even though we speak the same language, there's definitely different ways of looking at things, right? And so for him, part of bridging that divide, right, is by using the model of international sort of like cultural exchange, right, in the domestic sense here in America, in order for people to understand each other better, right? So we're going to go to paragraph 7 here, right? So he's saying ProPublica reporter Alec McGillis recently suggested in the New York Times that if hipsters wanted to promote their progressive agendas, they should move to Iowa, right? But I'm not thinking here about political change as much as providing political understanding, right? And this is, I think, a good move to sort of like clarify his position. Excuse me. Right. So here, what he's doing is what we call clarifying specific arguments through negation, right? By clarifying what you're saying by saying what it's not, right? Um, so what he's saying here is that it's not sort of like political change that he's interested in, right? But political understanding, right? And I'm going to try to explain what the difference is, right? I think what he's saying here is that political change is merely saying, oh, I want to change your mind and make you a Democrat, right? For example, if, not if, but I am pretty much a Democrat, right? So if I, for example, have a Republican friend, right, which I do, what political change, right, would do is for me to talk to that person and convince them to believe in what I believe in, right, and possibly change parties, right, which a lot of people are doing, right. They want to sort of make people understand what sort of the Democratic Party is, and maybe convince them to switch parties, right, switch political parties, and become one of us, type of thing. Right. So I think that's the sort of like political change that he's saying, right? Political understanding, on the other hand, is more subtle, right? In that I want you to understand my perspective as a Democrat, but I don't necessarily want to change you, right? I just want you to understand where I'm coming from, and I want you to understand that I understand where you're also coming from, and I want us to sort of like meet halfway, right? Understand each other without necessarily changing each other's positions, but sort of like evolving our understanding, right? Or evolving our ideas based on understanding each other's perspectives, right? Not necessarily based on disagreements, but on, oh, where do we differ, but then where do we sort of agree, right? And then maybe finding a common ground, right? So I think that's, for him, that's the difference between political change and political understanding. And for him, it's more valuable to make people understand, right, than just to change people, right? And so what he's saying here, right, is that by through, right, a domestic exchange program, his goal, right, is not necessarily to change people's ideas, right, but to allow students, right, to experience or to be friends, right, with people that they disagree with, right? Not to change them, but to make them better understand where these people are coming from, right? So true for, say, a Republican going into a more liberal state, right? The point is to make them understand, why are these liberals talking like this? Why do they think like this, right? But vice versa, right? To take, right, a liberal person perhaps and put them in a sort of conservative context, right? And also make them understand, why do Republicans think like this, right? And so through that sort of cultural exchange, it's not to change each other, but to make each other understand their positions, right, without necessarily changing, right. I think for Smith, that's a more sustainable way of dealing with things, right, dealing with the divide, than just convincing people to change and become part of us, right? So I think that's one of the key sort of arguments, right? And the same with, like the international model, right? Like in the international exchange program, you're not really, you go spend a year, for example, an American would spend a year in China, for example, right? And it's not to like make you Chinese, right? You're not going to become Chinese in just 1 year, right? Or at all, right? The point is to to just have a better understanding, right, of the culture, of the education system, and of the political system, right? Um, so same here. They're not trying to, he's not trying to like change people through this program, but to make them better understand each other. So let's go to paragraph 10, right? And this is a longish paragraph that I'm going to read here. Right, so paragraph 10, the program could be set up similarly to how international exchange is run. For example, for more developed international programs, they often have a satellite campus abroad where students go to study, thereby replicating some of what the students have at home. The second model, more relevant in this case, is where students from a number of institutions go to a foreign university to study. Right. Here, the home colleges and universities have entered into arrangement with the foreign host to accept students for the term, and often students stay with host families or other people in the country. Right. For example, when my son did study abroad in Turkey, he didn't live on campus with other exchange students. Rather, he got a flat with other local Turkish students. That provided him with an experience that was more genuine. So right, pretty much what I sort of explained earlier is that the model of international exchange program is what he's trying to do domestically, right? As a part of a cultural exchange, right? And notice here again how he used his son as an example, right? So there is a sort of like a personal trend to his to his narrative, right? And this is a perfectly good way of using a personal example, right? Because the personal example is directly related to what he's talking about, right? And so, right. And this is part of his detailed sort of proposal, right? And he's talking about how it's been done in other countries and how it can work domestically, right? And so we're going to move on to paragraph 11 and paragraphs 11 and 12. For a domestic exchange program, I could imagine institutions in red rural and blue urban parts of America hosting and housing students. But a model that probably would provide the best cultural immersion would be having students live with host families, right? Fortunately, this concept is not a new one. The idea of students participating in programs in other parts of America has been done. American University has long hosted students in its Washington semester program, right? So the end of paragraph 11 here on top, he's saying, right, that how we're going to implement the domestic exchange program would be similar to international exchange program in that the students would be hosted by local families, for example, right? And then here he's using an example, right? Not a direct example, but a somewhat similar example of how this is actually already happening, right? So American University has long hosted students in its Washington semester program. So he's pointing out this is actually already being done, right? But in this context, how it's being done is not the same as how he wants it to do, right? Because I think, if I'm not mistaken, if you read the entire paragraph here, um, this example that he's referring to is a very sort of like specific exchange program where one student from one American university to another would go to sort of um, to 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 study kind of like a specific field, right? And so there is that program already exists where you can spend a semester or um, a maybe a year, right, from one American university to another, right? I think that's also true in the UC system, right? Here in California for grad students, for me, for example, right? Um, if I wanted to, I could have taken a class in at UCLA, or I was actually planning on taking a class at UCLA this quarter if this whole pandemic didn't happen. Yeah, because there's a professor there that I wanted to work with. And so the UC system allows graduate students to work with other professors at other universities, right? So I was actually pretty excited about it because I wanted to work with this professor at UCLA and take one of her classes, right? Also at UC San Diego, there's a professor there that I wanted to work with, and so if I wanted to, I could have spent a semester there. So this kind of like domestic exchange programs, right, are already happening, um, and so what he's saying is we just have to like make this even more. We just have to like make um, or expand, I guess, right? This exchange program, just to make it available to more students, right? But more specifically, to instead of them like living on their own, allow them to sort of like live with other um, a host family, for example, right? Um, and we're actually doing this already, but like how students when they go to college they usually go from one state to another, right? And then you guys are probably, some of you might be from another state or from another city, and you're sort of staying in a dormitory here, so you get to socialize with other students who also, so that is already sort of happening, right? But I think what he's saying here that we can, instead of you sort of like you're pretty much going to spend your entire undergraduate career 4 years, right, at UCR. But what he's saying here is we can do this kind of one semester maybe, or like 1 year, where a student would go to another university and be hosted by a family, and specifically from one sort of like conservative state, right, to um, to a more sort of like blue state or liberal state, right, and vice versa. So there's a lot of examples already that he didn't mention it here, but I think that um, he could have used as an example, right, of how this already is working, right. And maybe what we need is just more funding, right, from the government to more sort of scholarships to allow students to do these kinds of programs, right. So I think, yeah, I think, if you look at the structure, right, there are parts here that you can just imitate, right? Like, what is he doing? How is he sort of like breaking down the problems, right? And then how is he breaking down the solutions, right? So here's the problem, of the division, and here's what people are saying, the reasons for the problems are, what the pundits are saying, right? And then here's my solution, right? Here's the model of my solution, which is international exchange program, and then here's how we can adapt that domestically, right? And so, right, so follow his structure here if you want. Also, read the other essays and see if there's structures in those other essays that you think works better for your essay, and feel free to follow that structure. right? And then I'll just end with the conclusion here, right? Paragraph 14. A national collegiate exchange program would allow students to see another person who differs from them, not as a foe or someone to fear, but as an individual whom they could build relationships with, right? By offering opportunities to connect Americans in a domestic residential setting, they can explore values, dreams, and aspirations, right? That would promote commonality and identity, shared experiences, and make real our national motto, E Pluribus Unum, or from many one, right? So, I mean, I have issues with kind of philosophical issues with this essay, but you know, it's a good essay, right? Um, and it's a good example of proposing a solution, but right. So this conclusion, he's sort of like repeating the importance of, and you can kind of like, there's a sentimental tone, right, to the conclusion. Most conclusions and most introductions are usually sentimental because you kind of like want to get sort of like the emotional appeal, or you want to sort of like make an emotional appeal, right, to your readers, and so that's part of that. But yeah, he's repeating the title here, E Pluribus Unum. He's repeating the importance of why we should understand each other better, right? Right, so I think this is a good essay to look over and see what he's doing and imitate some of the things that he's doing, right? But like I said, you want to be using quotations and citations and sources, right, as opposed to what he's doing. And so I think that's it for this video. I will have another shorter video also, maybe on Sunday, a video on the two other readings, right? The they say, I say, and the paragraph reading. If you can't find that, copies of the PDF are also on iLearn, right? So the revised syllabus is on iLearn. The PDFs are also on iLearn. So if you, I know like I email you a lot, and so the emails could get lost. So just know that the PDFs and like all of the forms, right, that I'm emailing you, I've also uploaded on iLearn, right? So you have an easier access there if you want. So on Sunday, I will give you your prompt for the second essay, and then I'll also upload the second video for the other readings, right? So I will see you then.